My name is Wendy Wagner-Robeson, and Caleb was my intern this past summer. And what we're going to do is, if you have questions, write them down, because questions are going to be done at the very end. So write them down, remember them. But we're going to go in this order. And from 4:30 to 5:30, we'll do presentations, and then we'll have questions. So let's get started with Izzy.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to my Ruhlman presentation today. Today I'll be talking about my senior honors thesis research in anthropology. While I describe my research to different people in different ways, depending on their level of interest and care in biological and forensic anthropology, what comes down to the bottom line is that my research is a two-pronged archival and forensic investigation into the background of the Wellesley Human Skeletal Anatomy Teaching Collection. That's a mouthful. Through this research, I seek to gain insight into the undeniably dubious history of the collection, in order to see how it compares with and exists in relation to other human skeletal anatomy collections from the early 20th century. But before we dive into the premise, method, results, and implications of this research, let's back up. What is a human skeletal anatomy teaching collection? A human skeletal anatomy teaching collection, or just a human anatomy collection, is made up of skulls, skeletons, and disarticulated material from a compilation of individuals. They're used for display, teaching, and research, and they're found most prominently at academic institutions such as medical schools, museums, and biology and biological anthropology departments at universities. These collections are compiled through purchase of skeletal material from wholesalers, as well as donations from medical schools and doctors and hobbyists' collections. The processing of the material, namely the fixture of the necessary screws and springs to articulate the material, was done either by medical schools or at the human skeletal anatomy wholesalers prior to purchase. So the Wellesley Human Skeletal Anatomy Collection was compiled in all of these ways. It was compiled through a series of donations from alumni and doctors, as well as purchases from Ward's National Science Establishment and other human skeletal material retailers. The Wellesley Human Skeletal Anatomy Teaching Collection originally existed as a display and teaching collection in the Wellesley Zoology Department at museum. Over the course of its lifetime, it was used in coursework in the hygiene and zoology departments to teach comparative anatomy and human physiology, and it's currently used in the biological sciences to teach comparative anatomy and in the anthropology department to teach forensic anthropology. Through primary source research in the Wellesley Archives and the Ward Archives at the University of Rochester Rare Books Special Collections and Preservation Department, we can understand how the Wellesley collection itself was compiled. To our knowledge, the first skeletal material was brought into the collection in 1914 through a donation from one Dr. Florence and a purchase from Ward's National Science Establishment. Over the years, more skeletal material was added to the collection, ending around 1956 when there became discussion of creating a unified biological sciences program. In 1974, they decided to build a science center, and the Zoology Museum was disbanded. As you'll know, today the taxidermy bird collection is displayed all around the Science Center, and the teaching collection of skeletal material is relocated to its current home in Biology Laboratory 314. The images you'll see on the screen are pictures of two of our skeletons, and they are showcasing the Ward's clutch standard, which is used to hold the skeleton together, especially this one on the left. They're used currently to teach different types of anthropology and biology. So, the Wellesley collection itself consists of 34 skulls, 5 fully articulated hanging and standing skeletons, 6 disarticulated skeletons, and 3 disarticulated skulls. And on the right, you'll see a picture of our skull cabinet. The background information gleaned through research in the archival past of the Wellesley Collection leads us to ask questions about the populations it represents, especially in terms of sex and ancestry. And not only this, but how does the demographic composition of the sample compare to what is known about other early 20th century anatomical collections? Forensic anthropology uses methods of measurement and observation to create a biological profile of an individual, and this includes is included but not limited to sex, age, and ancestry. The data that establish these standards primarily come from human skeletal anatomy teaching collections. In our research, we use two different softwares to collect osteological data, OsteoWare and Fordisk. OsteoWare is hosted by the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of Natural History, and it collects metric and non-metric data in different modules. We use the inventory, age and sex, macromorphoscopics, craniometrics, and summary modules to document the collection, but today we'll predominantly be focusing on the craniometrics method, which is utilized in Fordisk. Fordisk is a software created by Jansen Owsley at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. The program takes metric data, namely craniometrics, from anatomical collections, forensic cases, and archaeological sites, and it sorts those represented individuals into respective groups of sex and ancestry. When statistically analyzed using discriminant functions, these demographics can then be compared to the unknown individuals in data to establish a potential demographic membership. After recording our skeletal materials and our data in OsteoWare, we analyzed it using Fordisk. Given the likely makeup of the collection based on the context of other collections from the early 20th century, we first compared the unknown individuals in our collection to only black and white male and female demographics, and then later to all 13 represented samples. Following the Anatomy Act of 1832, all unclaimed bodies found at public institutions could be taken for anatomical dissection and collections. Poor and marginalized communities at this time were more likely to not claim a relative's body given the expense of burial. This disproportionately affects the composition of anatomical collections, especially in terms of the populations that they represent. But this means that rather than representing early 20th century populations equally, anatomical collections are much more likely to be comprised of individuals from underprivileged and minority and low socioeconomic groups. This is represented by our analysis of the collection using Fordisk, which suggests that 20 of the 34 individuals in our collection, roughly 59%, are of African American ancestry, and 14 individuals, or 41%, are of European American ancestry. While these results do make sense given the collection compilation practices in the early 20th century, Fordisk's ability to categorize unknown individuals into sample populations is only as good as the sample populations that are represented. This means that if our unknown individuals in the collection are not represented by the populations that we checked out in Fordisk, they won't be correctly identified, and this can potentially affect our results. So Fordisk also estimates that of the sex of our collections, which suggests that the sample includes 28 females and 6 males. And our non-metric estimation of the sex using OsteoWare neither confirms nor denies the strong female bias in Fordisk about the collection. These results actually go directly against the composition of collections from the early 20th century, which favor male specimens instead of female specimens. Male specimens are more commonly found in anatomical collections because were preferred as dissection cadavers in medical schools, given that the bodies tended to be larger and tended to have less body fat, which made them easier to dissect. Because the skeletal material in anatomical collections was taken from cadavers following their dissection in coursework, this skews the demographic composition of sex in the majority of collections. Ultimately, our results of this investigation show that of the 34 skulls that we have, 28 were classified as female by Fordisk, 20 were classified as black, and 17 of the 28 female skulls are classified as black, which implicates a significant bias towards black females in the collection. Because social and economic factors affected the number of females available for dissection in the early 20th century, there were very few to be included in the skeletal collection. This quote references ideas put forth by medical schools in choosing having more predominantly male collections. And it reinforces the significance of the sex composition of the Wellesley Collection. It's important that the number of female classified individuals within the Wellesley Collection be evaluated in the context of Wellesley College's historical role as an institution focused on women's education and dedication to this purpose, especially during a time of palpable preference towards men. Because archival investigation failed to reveal the context of Wellesley's acquisitions, it is therefore unclear if the sex bias of our sample is a product of intentional choices by the college, the outcome of a donor's donation to the college's collection, or a wholesale supplier's notions of what was appropriate for a women's college, or some combination of these three different methods. But at the same time, we must also look critically at the implications of race in the demographic composition. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many thought that dissection was an indignity that was too horrible to be inflicted even on poor white women. This expression of indignity did not, however, extend to poor black women, who are much more commonly found in anatomical collections, including the one at Wellesley. Of the 28 female classified individuals in the Wellesley Collection, Fordyce classified 17 of them as black, which expresses the racial dichotomy which continues to resonate in today's society, where black women tend to be more sexualized and less preferred than white female bodies. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with this quote. "The skull is man's final claim to individuality. After the fleshy features have disintegrated and each skeleton separates into the anonymous bones, only the cranium and each remains to distinguish one individual from another. Even in death, every head remains different. The three squiggly lines that mark where the cranium sections join trace varying patterns, no two exactly alike." Anatomy collections do not exist in a vacuum. They are comprised of people with their own life stories. The individuality of specimens in anatomical collections must not only be noted but considered in their use as teaching tools. In order to understand these collections as a whole, we must first understand at the individual level and then at the demographic level. Analysis of the collection leads us to pose further questions about what groups are represented and the implications of their inclusion. Our understanding is based in the composition of the Wellesley Collection and knowledge of the history of similar collections. By looking at the processes involved in creating collections, we can better see how marginalization plays a role in the creation of anatomical collections and also better interpret the nuances of what it means to own one. Thank you all so much for coming to my Ruhlman presentation. I am so thankful for the support of my advisor, Professor Van Arsdale, my thesis committee, and my friends and family. I couldn't have done this research without you, and I really appreciate all of your unwavering encouragement. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and should you have any questions about the collection, my research, or anatomical collections at large, please feel free to ask me questions after the session. Thank you.
Very much like Izzy, before I begin, I first just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out to watch our Ruhlman presentations. I think it's really great that Wellesley gives students a day to showcase their research, and it only makes it all the more special that you all came out to watch, so thank you. My name is Sophia Zupanc, and I'm a former high school geometry failure. Okay, so I see there were some laughs, but there were a couple more concerned looks. But don't worry, the story ends pretty well because I ended up here at Wellesley. But in all actuality, in high school geometry, I really struggled. Okay, now there are some more accepting faces. So why don't we get a quick hand raise of anybody who happened to struggle in high school geometry or just struggle in visualizing three-dimensional shapes? All right, so see, I'm not alone. Students throughout the United States struggle in high school geometry because they lack the ability to properly visualize three-dimensional objects. So when I was given the opportunity this past January to go back to my old high school and work in the mathematics department, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to find a way to help students like myself, students who struggled to spatially visualize three-dimensional objects in geometry classrooms. So this Ruhlman presentation is going to focus on three main things. First, the way that I was able to implement 3D printing and modeling technology into the geometry classroom. Second, the lessons that we designed around 3D printing. And lastly, the tangible benefits that students saw through the enrichment. So before I started, I just wanted to kind of give you an example of what my nightmare was when I was 14 years old in geometry. And it was problems like this. Looking at it now, it doesn't look all that difficult, but as a 14-year-old, that was pretty daunting. And it was especially concerning because as a student who had always been considered good at math, being faced with a problem like this and not being able to link the formulas that I had learned in class to the problem itself made me really discouraged and really deterred me from pursuing mathematics at a higher level. So that also turned out to be a pretty big issue in my grade because, as you can see, the educational standards for both Ohio and then the newly implemented Common Core really stress a student's ability to visualize and then further manipulate these three-dimensional objects. Now, additionally, up on the board, I included a quote from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, Principles and Standards for School Mathematics, which asks that students have a deep, almost intuitive understanding of mathematics. And so I thought, how can I get students to have that deep, almost intuitive understanding? Because I knew if I had, a deep, intuitive understanding of what these shapes were when I was in geometry, problems like the one that I just showed you wouldn't have been so scary. So like any good future Wellesley student, I did my research. And I stumbled upon the Van Hillel theory of geometric thought, which is a basic pedagogy that describes how students go about learning geometry. Now, in the paper that Van Hillel released along with this hierarchy, he said that most of high school geometry learning should take place at level 4, the deduction level. But as I began looking more at the hierarchy and actually reading more about it, I discovered that a lot of my issues in high school geometry started because I was struggling at level 3, the ability to think of geometry abstractly, because I couldn't, realize the importance of the properties or the relationships among them. So I thought, okay, I want students to get this deep intuitive understanding, and I want them to be able to realize the relationships between finding the areas of faces and linking that to the greater surface area or volume of three-dimensional figures. So luckily, my high school has a 3D printer, and I figured, well, the perfect way to do that is to implement 3D printing into the geometry classroom. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with 3D printing, this is basically what one looks like. And if technology works, which, it will, this short video is going to actually, maybe it's not working. This short video is actually going to show a 3D printer in action. So as you can see, what it's basically doing right now is layer by layer, it's laying down sheets of plastic. Now, the way it's getting the directions to do that is through a computer program that had been written previously. So what that means is that as long as you can basically write a program to 3D print something, it's entirely possible to do. And that's extraordinarily powerful in high school geometry classrooms, where a lot of the shapes might be hard to make traditional educational manipulatives out of. And so before we went straight to having students design and model their own 3D objects, we wanted to introduce them to 3D printing slowly, because we too wanted them to have an appreciation of the true power of this technology. So one of the units, or one of the lessons in this greater unit that's all about finding the volume and the surface area of three-dimensional figures, is learning how to find the area of the face of a figure. And some of the figures that we use most commonly are polygonal prisms. So polygons are figures like that. So they'd be like a pentagon, an octagon. And the way that in my high school students are taught to find the area of a polygon is through finding the area of one of the isosceles triangles, like the ones you see up there, and then multiplying it by the number of isosceles triangles that's in the greater polygon. Okay, so now I see some confused faces. So for those that didn't raise their hand at the little question, maybe think about your answer. But what this unit really did, when I was learning that as a student, that was really difficult because I thought, okay, I have this like pentagon, and my teacher's telling me that I need to find all these isosceles triangles in it, but I can't see that. How am I supposed to know where all these isosceles triangles go? So what me and the teachers that I worked with did is we actually 3D printed different isosceles triangles and made it like a puzzle. So students would take the isosceles triangles and put it together to get the shape of the pentagon or any other polygon that they were dealing with. And as you can see in the photograph, some of the students were filling out like a guided notes kind of packet worksheet that allowed them to walk the steps through finding the area of the polygon by first measuring and finding the area of an isosceles triangle, then putting it together, and then multiplying it by the number of isosceles triangles in the entire polygon. So that was really useful, and it really kind of clued our students into the true power of 3D printing. And so that, in combination with a couple other short lessons we did, led to this, which was the final lesson of the unit. In this lesson, we wanted to put the power of creativity and the power of learning directly in the hands of students. And so the way that we did that was through the use of a 3D modeling software called BlockSCAD. Now, the compiler for BlockSCAD is on the board, and it's a pretty low-level basic computer programming language, which was really nice because it meant for students who are traditionally deterred by 3D or by computer programming, it'd be extremely accessible. So all you do in BlockSCAD to create a shape in that small compiler that you see right there is you drag and drop one of these pieces of code, and then in where the blue small puzzle pieces are, you write in the dimension that you want. So that could be like if you're creating a cube or a rectangular prism, you could write like 10 by 10 by 10. And you'd have a cube that is 10 units long, 10 units wide, and 10 units high. And so it allows students to have a lot of freedom when they're going through the activities, because they're directly creating the shapes that they're going to be asked to find the volume and the surface area of, as opposed to having a teacher just give them that and telling them to apply the formulas. So what we did off of that was create a worksheet similar to the worksheet that we used for the polygon activity, which was a very student-driven activity. This is just a short screenshot from one of the pages of the packet. It was a couple pages longer, and this is the page in which we asked students to create what we called an n-gon, which is really just a polygonal prism. And so as you can see above, we'd ask students to physically drag and drop the code, and then choose the sizes and the number of sides that they wanted for their own prism. Now, this is extremely useful for students because it allows them to directly see the relationship between finding the area of the face and finding the surface area of the greater polygon. It really solidifies that understanding while honing in on their own creative powers. And at the conclusion of the unit, when we asked students to provide us feedback, because this was an entirely new and experimental unit, a lot of the results that we got were overwhelmingly positive. And I just wanted to showcase one of the results here on the board because I thought it was particularly telling of the powers of 3D printing in the classroom. This particular student wrote, "The activity with the computers," in reference to the BlockSCAD activity we did, "really helped me. I didn't feel rushed to try and learn something." She didn't feel rushed. That's perhaps the most critical part of this response, that rather than feeling like the teacher was presenting her with a bunch of overwhelming formulas and asking her to apply them to shapes, the student didn't feel rushed. She was excited to come to class every day and use the technology that we had presented for her to forge her own path towards learning. And at the end of the day, as educators, our job is to excite and inspire our students to learn. And by implementing 3D printing into the geometry classroom and putting the power back in the hands of students, we did just that. And that's why at the end of the unit, 100% of students surveyed reported having a better and deeper understanding of three-dimensional geometry. So my presentation's done. I didn't have a thank you slide, but I definitely do want to extend a couple thanks before I get down. First, thank you to Professor Kenneth Hawes in the Education Department for allowing me to walk into his office, having never met me before, and taking on my Ruhlman presentation. Second, to Mr. Matthew Vanek, who is a teacher at my high school, which is Gilmore Academy in Gates Mills, Ohio, for his infinite wisdom about 3D printing and his almost limitless guidance and ability to use the technology. And lastly, and probably most sincerely, to Miss Mary Merkel, who was the teacher that I worked with along this project. She's definitely been one of the most inspiring educators that I've had in my life and one of the better friends that I could have asked for. So thank you, guys.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming.
Yes, Mr.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. I feel pretty amazing to be on a panel with such special people and see some similarities in education. So today we're going to be talking about SEED Kit, Science, Education, Equity, Development Kit, in which we've created a lab in a box to address gendered science, education, and equities. I'm Caleb Bercu. I don't know if I mentioned that, and this is going to be a little less formal. So, why SEED Kit? Going into this project, I actually had a personal incentive. When I was 16 years old, I worked on a campaign to help fund a girl through high school at a school in Morogoro, Tanzania. And then the school actually asked me to come and visit and volunteer at the school for a month. That experience was really wonderful, and I ended up finishing high school and coming to Wellesley thinking, okay, great, but now what can I do? Especially since reflecting upon that and going through my women's and gender studies courses, I realized that the approach of coming into another place and teaching or, I don't know, sharing views might not be the best thing. And I tried to think, what could I do for girls and women in Tanzania and for the educational standards? And I began my investigation into what I could do about 2 years ago. So first, we're going to use Tanzania as a case study to just get a better idea of what might be happening. So Tanzania is 156 of 175 poorest nations. The male to female ratio is pretty much normal, and 68% of the population lives on less than $1.25 a day, which means there's just widespread poverty, and 51% of the population is under 18. This is a really striking number because it is a large, it's 51% of the population. And if you think about a government, the government has to provide education to 51% of the population. So when it comes to education, there's a 9-year expectancy. So students are only expected to go a little bit over high school and into middle school. The male literacy rate is 79%, while the female literacy rate is a little lacking at 67%. Females as a percent of males enrolled in secondary school only comes up to 87.5%. And if we're thinking about this number, some things have to do with this, like marriage, where 6.6% of girls are married by age 15. And 36.9% of girls are married by age 19. And so when girls get married, they can't go to school because they assume other duties in their lives. Seed Kit we used East Africa as a focus just simply because I had been there twice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's limited to, the project isn't limited to East Africa. But as I kept continuing on with my research, I came upon this paper by Musau et al., and it had talked about this kind of cultural emergence in 2008 in Kenya and Tanzania, when studies showed that only 4% of students enrolled in university taking engineering classes were women. Only 4%, and only 5% in total in Kenya of students taking STEM classes were women. And so more research was done to figure out what was happening. So here we have some data that shows the different means as scored by women in secondary school. So math, chemistry, biology, physics, and agriculture. These are the sciences. Agriculture was seen as more of a female science, and where math, chemistry, biology, and physics was more of a male science. So 6 is the mean. It's a little striking that almost nowhere other than in agriculture, actually nowhere other than in agriculture, girls received a 6 on average. So why was this so? Further investigation showed that a lot of this had to do with the allotment of resources, especially in a place that might have limited resources. So students who had instructional resources, you could imagine how important this could be in science, scored above average. And if we compare it to the students where there were no resources available, 0% of those students scored above average, 0% of those students scored average, and the rest of them fell very much behind. So SeedKit was born based off of that research. After that, somehow my drive and passion for education, gender equity, and feminism came into this project. We met with a feminist ethicist to confirm that the project was very much solidified and we're taking a good approach, and we've definitely taken upon intersectionalized feminism within every step we take. So, SeedKit. In summary, SeedKit is a sustainable, reusable, low-cost lab-in-a-box designed to use in secondary school classrooms without running water or electricity. The primary focus is to provide hands-on learning to support women and girls in STEM. So this is actually an example of a chemistry seed kit that we put together. But we have biology kits available, physics kits, and each kit includes 4 to 6 experiments. This one at the time only included 4. And the kits include teaching protocols, which don't necessarily need to be facilitated by a teacher, student protocols, which can be done simply just by students, and you don't even need a teacher, and all of the materials are included. Any of the materials that need replaced can be found locally, all over the world, even in most imaginable environments. But most of the materials provided are supposed to be reusable. So there's very little need for replacement. And the kits are designed for up to a class of 25 students. And so far, we've on average spent about $15 per kit. So when you think about your high school science classes and all of those chemicals you used, they're probably very expensive. And we've pretty much substituted those with a little bit of oil, vinegar, baking soda, and food coloring. It's pretty amazing how much science you have just lying around in your kitchen or in the garbage. So, Seed Kit has been a work in progress for 2 years, and last summer we had this incredible opportunity to pair up the African Women's Advocacy Project, which is in Ghana, for our alpha testing. The project reached out to us and they said, hey, we are a group of teachers, mostly women, who really believe in teaching girls science, and we would love to see your Seed Kit in action, and we could also really use it in our schools. But they weren't aimed at secondary schools. It was more about middle school and some younger students. Regardless, they graded our chemistry seed kit on a scale of 1 to 5 on multiple components, and we ended up getting a solid 4, as they said, which is high marks because it wasn't originally developed for the age group that our teachers would be addressing. But we are so grateful to have partnered with Seed Kit this summer and hope for many more opportunities to come. This was a good sign for us because this made us realize that we really could continue with this project. It was something that people liked, something they found useful, and something helpful in a way that there wasn't any kind of imperialistic intervention at all. And actually, we're sending 5 more full seed kits, physics, biology, and chemistry to Ghana in May to these same teachers because they liked it so much. The next steps for Seed Kit. Well, before that, I think you guys are probably still wondering what other science experiments you can make from trash. Believe it or not, you really can. So, first off, in the left-hand corner, those are pennies, cardboard soaked in vinegar and salt, and an LED light. That entire project cost about 10 cents, and what you're actually doing is creating a battery. So we have an entire experiment on how you can make your own battery from the change in your pocket. This is an example of an electrolysis experiment. So maybe some of you could recognize that that's a pH indicator. Well, you can actually find pH indicators in a lot of fruits and vegetables. We used cabbage. All you have to do is soak cabbage in a little bit of hot water, and 10 minutes later you've got a really strange looking purple solution which reacts fantastic in an acidic or basic environment. So what we're doing here is we're actually using pencils as electrodes. So we're running a current through them using a rechargeable battery, which is recharged through a homemade solar panel charger made with stuff from the dollar store. And through the graphite, an electric current travels through the solution and splits water up into hydrogen and oxygen. So you can see the pink part is actually showing where the acid is, where the hydrogen, and the blue part is showing where the oxygen is. And that experiment is reusable, and it costs, oh gosh, maybe 10 cents, other than the battery, which is also used in our other seed kits. So this is pretty much what Seed Kit is. And from now, we've actually gotten some very exciting news this week that the Aga Khan schools in Mumbai are very much interested in Seed Kit. And so we hopefully will be taking Seed Kit to Mumbai for 10 weeks and spreading Seed Kit all around schools there and see where that might take us, especially since the Aga Khan schools are located all over the whole world. After that, we're also planning to put all of our procedures and how you can make your own seed kit on our website so that this can be even more accessible to everyone. How much time do I have? 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Okay, perfect. So, one of the coolest parts of Seed Kit is something called a fold scope. So pass these out. I'm gonna need them back once you're done. And believe it or not, these are microscopes. And they're made of paper, lenses, like the same ones in your iPhone. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so everyone has either an ant leg, which I dissected, or you have a blue fish scale. The fish scale was dyed. Now, here's your microscope. It costs 25 cents to make. It's made of paper and a little lens. SeedKit has started making our own, which costs 10 cents to make. This was developed by a lab at Stanford. Well, let's play with it. So, this is your lens here. If you wear glasses, take them off. And you can just put your eye right up to the lens. And you kind of want to hold it up into the light. And using your thumbs, you can wiggle your lens around to find your specimen on your slide. Just hold it right up to your face. Don't be shy.
Wait, what part should be on your eye?
The little black lens that looks like a little polka dot. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm. Science doesn't have to be expensive. It can be made of the littlest of things you would never imagine. And it's really, really easy to spread science all over the world. But all you have to do is just think a little bit more creatively. I'd like to acknowledge Wendy Robeson for advising me through this process of SeedKit, the Wellesley College Biology Department, the President's Office for their generous support, Wellesley Centers for Women, and a special thank you to the entire SeedKit team, including Professor David Elleby. And I just want to be sure to mention that this was a huge team effort. There are 6 other students that work with me, and without them, this project would be nothing. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, sorry.
So we are playing a little bit with Ruhlman presentation, and we're treating ours today as a listening launch party. So you'll learn a little bit more about what I mean by that. But our presentation is going to be about ethnic studies and the case for implementing programs across high schools in the nation. I'm Rita Marquez.
I'm Andrea Aguilar. And I'm Alejandra Cuin. So before we dive into showcasing our podcast, we just want to kind of talk to you a little bit. Well, first, we created this podcast for a class we took called Politics of Inequality with Professor Morel. And essentially, he tasked us with creating a short 10-minute podcast about some aspect of inequality in our education system. We found this to be a really interesting assignment because typically you're assigned like a 20-page research paper at the end of a class like this. So we were really excited about doing this project. And essentially the purpose of our podcast is twofold. First, we wanted to provide information about what ethnic studies is, but more importantly, we wanted to kind of explore some of the benefits of ethnic studies and advocate for its further implementation.
And so a little bit about the process. I guess I want to start off by saying it wasn't, I guess, as hectic as I would have imagined. But it was great that it was like a long project throughout the class. And the first thing that we had to focus on was the storyboard, which is more like an outline if you were to put it to a paper. And so the storyboard, we included where we're going to include our interviews, where we were going to speak, basically the outline, where we were going to include the history of ethnic studies, etc. And the more going into this podcast, we had to do more research on who we were going to interview and the purpose of why we were interviewing them. And so everyone we reached out to, we had a specific reason to do so. We really wanted to cater this podcast to students specifically who are not aware of what ethnic studies is. So high school students specifically. And a lot of the people we reached out to were teachers, and it happened to be that both teachers are from California, one from Oakland and one from Los Angeles. And we also talked to a researcher from the Stanford School of Education who did research on the effects of ethnic studies. And we also interviewed a student who is currently in high school taking an ethnic studies course in Los Angeles. And one of the teachers we interviewed is her teacher. And right now in the process that we're in, we're editing the podcast. So right now it's a lot of like editing the sounds, editing what we need to cut out, because right now we're a little bit over time, where the podcast is actually 5 to 7 minutes and we're like at 9 minutes. So we really need to cut out like a solid 2 minutes, because we still need to include like transitions and music, etc. So
We are open to questions, concerns, criticisms, any advice you might want to give us after listening to the podcast.
and
We'll let this tell the story for us.
yeah. So here we go. Where is it? Oh, okay.
What do we do? Fight back! Our education's under attack! What do we do? Fight back! Our education's under attack! What do we do? Fight back!
These are the voices of high school students protesting Arizona House Bill 2281, the controversial bill that went into effect in 2011 and banned public schools from offering ethnic studies courses. Advocates of the bill argued that ethnic studies curriculums promoted the overthrow of the U.S. government, fostered racial resentment, advocated ethnic solidarity, and were designed for students of a particular ethnic group. The controversy surrounding Arizona Bill 2281 brought national attention to the issue of teaching high school students courses which highlight issues of race.
Nobody bats an eye in a university if you have a history of Mexico or a history of China or history of the Middle East or whatever. In a multi-ethnic society like the United States, why it needs to be so controversial at the high school level, escapes me.
The College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University defines ethnic studies as a form of pedagogy that analyzes structural forms of oppression and addresses the intersections of race, ethnicity, with other forms of identity and social status.
Ethnic studies is a course that helps us, students and myself as well as a teacher, to understand more where and why it is that we as a country and as a city and as a community are the way that we are.
David Coe, a teacher at George Washington High School in San Francisco, has been teaching ethnic studies for 8 years and personally understands the benefits that this area of study has for different students of color.
My grandfather came to the United States illegally in 1939 as a paper son. In 1882, Congress passed a law barring Chinese immigration. The 1906 earthquake destroyed the records and allowed a significant number of Chinese immigrants into the country, lying, saying that they were relatives of people who were already here. The fact that I know that is only because my grandfather happened to tell my father, who happened to tell me.
Not everyone has the opportunity to learn the histories of their own communities, and for students like Miranda, ethnic studies courses are an important source of knowledge into her own background and the decision of her family to emigrate to the United States.
We were learning about how all these corrupt presidents were in charge, and I appreciate my parents more because I can't believe that they came over to the United States just to give their kids a better life, and I really appreciate all they've done for me.
Ethnic studies was first developed in 1968 at San Francisco State University following the longest student strike at a U.S. college campus to date. The protests were led by the Third World Liberation Front, a coalition of student ethnic organizations who called for campus-wide reform, including greater access to higher education, the hiring and retention of more faculty of color, and the implementation of a new curriculum that focused on the history and culture of marginalized communities. Since 1968, more than 60 colleges and universities across the nation now offer ethnic studies as a field of discipline. Protests also fueled the spread of ethnic studies courses at the high school level.
The Mexican American Studies classes were added as a result of the UCLA student blowouts in '68.
Carlos Jimenez has been teaching Mexican American Studies in LAUSD for the past 4 decades and has been involved in developing programs across different regions of the United States. Though ethnic studies has been in existence for decades in several high schools, the institutionalization of many high school programs is a more recent development. In 2014, El Rancho Unified School District became the first one in California to adopt a measure requiring students to take an ethnic studies course in order to graduate. Since then, several other high school districts across California have followed suit, with many more high schools offering the curriculum across the nation. George Washington High School introduced a pilot program for ethnic studies, which which catalyzed the implementation of similar curriculums in the surrounding areas.
They were kind of in the planning steps. And the main thing that spoke to me was the idea of being able to actually create a class from the ground up and not have it be tied, for example, to any kind of standardized test, or not have it be tied to what the state of California decided was really important for students to learn, but instead what I and other teachers thought was important and what students themselves found relevant.
Researchers found that incorporating culturally relevant pedagogy into high school curriculums has significant effects on students. Emily Penner, a postdoctoral fellow in the Stanford School of Education, and Dr. Thomas D. analyzed a pilot program of ethnic studies classes at several San Francisco high schools.
We found that students who took the course actually did have huge improvement in a number of the areas that had been the focus of the teachers who designed the course, actually. We found positive effects on the end of ninth grade attendance, the credits that students earned, and their GPA. They were really big effects. We were sort of surprised, actually, because effects this large are not very common. Even though people design courses with interventions with the best of intentions, students who took the course in GPAs that were 1.4 grade points higher than the students who didn't take the course. And that's just a really astonishingly large effect.
And ethnic studies has more than just academic benefits. Miranda recognizes that these courses have also affected her social skills.
Usually I used to be a introverted, kind of shy type of person, but this class really got me out there, and I was so passionate about this class, so it made me a whole different person.
And students aren't the only ones who notice.
When the kids actually take a Mexican American Studies or Latin American Studies class with me, they totally blossom. It's amazing. They feel validated. They feel pride. They feel really smart and knowledgeable. They become much more confident.
We know the benefits that ethnic studies courses have on students of color, but how do these courses affect students whose background is not the focal point of a course?
I think all students benefit, and I think they definitely benefit in different ways. I've had, for example, some white students talk to me one-on-one and say that they previously had always felt self-conscious anytime that race came up, and that they still did to some degree, but that they had a better understanding of kind of where their classmates were coming from and why it was they felt self-conscious.
Miranda definitely notices the way her classmates of different cultural backgrounds engage within the classroom.
Ethnic studies is really important for everyone in general because it diminishes prejudice and makes us appreciate everyone and their struggle.
Based on everything we've learned, it doesn't seem like ethnic studies promotes the overthrow of the U.S. government, fosters racial resentment, advocates ethnic solidarity or separatism, or are designed only for students of a particular ethnic group. So why is ethnic studies such a polarizing issue?
Well, I think a large part of it has to do with sort of unfamiliarity and not knowing entirely what is being taught. And so people have seen whatever kind of assumptions of what the course is like and teaches. I think that's certainly one of the obstacles. And I think additionally, there's some percentage of the population believes that the way to solve racial problems is to not talk about them and to teach about them and to not learn about them because they are only problems if people know about them. And so for that category of people, I think studies courses are terrible because they teach your students about things that they would rather students not know about.
This sounds familiar. Former Superintendent of Arizona, Tom Horn, spearheaded the campaign to eliminate Mexican American studies in Arizona.
They're teaching them that they live in occupied Mexico, that Arizona, California, New Mexico, and some other states were taken from Mexico in 1848.
It seems Mr. Horn forgot the fact that the Mexican-American War did end with the United States annexing roughly half of the Mexican territory that today we know as the Southwest. This is not to say there aren't real and legitimate concerns surrounding ethnic studies, but it is safe to say that they don't include reverse racism.
What concern would be finding enough people to teach it in all the right places? And kind of that level of scale across the state is a big effort. And so thinking about how to do that smartly and carefully so that the program is actually implemented in a way that the people who support it would intend is a big consideration when thinking about state-level policy like that.
Such are the considerations school districts and policymakers alike must take into account when thinking about ethnic studies. Instead of focusing on dismantling a curriculum that has obvious benefits, the focus should be considering ethnic studies as a potential equalizer in the public school education system.
Okay. So that's our podcast. If you guys have questions about anything that you heard or just more about the process, you can talk to us during the Q&A.
And our final cut is due in a few days, actually. So if you're interested in hearing the final product in the future, you can definitely get in contact with us, and we would be happy to send that out.
Yep. We would also like to thank our Professor Morad, who was the one who kind of, pushed us to do this project.
He unfortunately couldn't be here. He's from Rhode Island, so it's
It's a bit of a
understandable.
commute.
But thank
you.
you.
Okay, so this gives us some time to ask people questions, and think of all the time they put into their work and into even doing this presentation for you. So don't run away yet. You have until 5:40, so there's no reason to get up. Unless you have a fire burning someplace or whatever. So let's go with questions. You must. Yes.
Well, I have sort of a comment-like question regarding ethnic studies. I guess the term could be problematic because everything that's taught is based in a certain ethnicity. It's just whether it's a majority or minority ethnicity. So the reality is in Arizona and everywhere else, they are teaching ethnic studies. They're teaching the study of the majority white Protestant ethnicity approach to history and social studies and everything else. What you're saying is there's value in teaching the history and culture of all the ethnicities, especially the ones represented in the classroom. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah. I think especially we're taking into account the fact that ethnicity, especially in the United States in our society, is used mostly to refer to the non-majority people of color, marginalized, queer, lower socioeconomic communities that we kind of targeted in our research. And so I think it's more a bit about what we hope to accomplish with this podcast is to kind of demystify this negative connotation that the word ethnic has for a lot of our society.
And my second question is regarding the seed kit. I guess you didn't have a lot of time, but on terms of the distribution strategy, in order to positively affect science education for girls, you'll have to think about that because on the one hand, your first distribution group was specifically women's advocacy group in Africa. But on the other hand, I don't know about the Aga Khan schools, but are they co-ed? And
Yes, I mean, we're not just solely women and girls focused, but we like to take that kind of approach since it's not usually taken. And also the Aga Khan schools are co-ed and also kind of acknowledge the kind of gender inequities that exist. And as for distribution, that was just our alpha testing. As we go forth, we're hoping for all kinds of different opportunities. The project's still a baby and it's growing, but it's growing fast. Yeah.
Yes.
Sophia, have you taken multivariable calculus?
I have. For better or for worse.
Yes. I was wondering how you feel about 3D printing models at that level, because I know when you're first learning to conceptualize 3D shapes, you sometimes it's really hard for a book to show it, but at some point do you think I don't know, what grade levels did you work with, and do you think it's applicable to higher levels as well?
Most definitely. So in this project that I did this past January, I worked specifically with high school geometry classrooms. But the reason why I was able to come back and do that project in January is because it was a bit of a continuation off of what I did for my senior project, which was using 3D printing in the calculus classroom. So in that, we actually we used a lot more higher level computer programming languages, so something called OpenSCAD, which is a computer-aided design program, dabbled a bit in Mathematica, which would be extremely useful in multi. But so the possibilities for higher levels of math are definitely there. There's Laura Tillman, who's a professor at I believe it's George Mason University in Virginia, really does a lot of great work with 3D printing in mathematics classrooms. She even does a whole thing on knot theory, and it's really neat because she's discovered a lot of different knots just through using 3D printing. So if you want to like look her up, she has a lot of really great stuff.
Yes. I have a question for Izzy. Did the software that you used to analyze Wellesley's collection allow you to sort of investigate backgrounds for the individuals and the collection beyond black and white?
So the way that the 4-disc material and the 4-disc software works is that it's only as good as the sample populations you have in it. The sample populations as 4-disc is set up, it has 13 sample populations from the forensic data bank, which is based off of 2 anatomical collections based out of the Smithsonian Institution, and a variety of forensic casework and archaeological site work from around the U.S., but also partially from around the world. It has a supplemental material of Howells, which is its own kind of archaeological compilation kind of situation that spans considerably across time periods, which brings into effect its own kind of error. So we decided that based off of the background of the collections, the history of anatomical collections, the populations they tend to affect, we thought that the best choice would be to look first at black and white populations from the early 20th century, which are represented in 4-disc. Then we did expand the search to the rest of the populations. One of the skulls I'm thinking of in the collection actually is most likely sourced out of Southeast Asia. A lot of the material in the 30s and 40s was sourced out of Southeast Asia. But because there are no Southeast Asian populations in 4-disc, we can't prove it. That would be a really interesting potential direction to go in for the future, to go in maybe less of a metric analysis type of direction and more of a morphoscopic direction using trait analysis and observation.
More questions? Okay, my first question. Wait,
this is for Sophia.
Yeah.
Have you ever looked into Montessori teachings of mathematics?
No, I haven't.
The shapes and like the using 3D printing is like very Montessori focuses on like younger kids and building with cubes and blocks, helping them figure out what math is at a younger age. And I think looking into that would kind of expand on that too. Just a little.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're right. And fortunately, 3D printing technology in both primary and secondary schools is becoming increasingly available. So I'm sure I know Montessori schools do really cool and great things. So I wouldn't be surprised if some are already pursuing that. But you're definitely right. It's another avenue to look into.
Okay, my first question about the bones. How do you know these bones only from like early 1900s? They could be in someone's closet or for years and years and years before Wellesley got them.
So that is entirely possible. So I did a lot of archival research at Wellesley and at the University of Rochester, kind of trying to go into the background of the collection to see where we got this material from. The Zoology Museum accessions book at Wellesley lists a variety of donations and purchases. Your question kind of focuses more on the donation. The purchases were almost entirely sold once they got the material and processed it. So that turnaround took about 6 months from receiving cadaver to processing the cadaver, fitting it with everything, and then selling it. The potential for donors or for hobbyists or for doctors to have held on to this material for ages and ages is possible, but given the extent of wear on the bones that we have in that collection, they don't look to be about more than a century old, which is what we're sourcing them to, is about 1914 is the first stuff.
Okay, Sophia.
Yeah.
Did everyone in the class get to make a 3D image? I mean, were they all programmed it, but did they get something at the end that they could hold in their hands?
So we printed a variety of educational materials before that lesson, and what we eventually decided to do was, just because there was about 60 kids that we were giving this lesson to, was we made it a little bit of a competition at the end, where we encouraged students to create like the wackiest 3D printing thing, or 3D shape that they could using the software, and then the winner in each class got printed.
And how big were these things? I saw the video, but how big? What you were showing, it was like kind of big.
So the one that you had seen up there was used for a different unit that was exploring the relationship between the volume of a sphere and the volume of cones. And so they were kind of big because we had students pouring water, because the volume of 2 cones equates to the volume of a sphere as long as they have the same diameter. Right, so they had to be kind of big. But you can print very small things. So we print like a whole variety of things. It's really whatever you want to make it, a 3D printer can do. It's interesting.
Throwing questions out there. I've got okay. Kayla. So if you go to the school this summer and there's boys and girls, will you focus on girls, or will you focus on, or is it like you have to give them equal treatment, or what are you going to do?
We'll focus on equal and equitable treatment. Yeah.
Okay, last group. Who do you think who will listen to the podcast? Once it's all done and up there, do you want high school teachers, parents, students, college? Who are you focusing your target audience?
Well, the podcast is going to be available to the wider college community. Our professor is looking into potentially making it available to a wider audience. We were just trying to make it more about making it for students themselves and teachers to a certain extent, people who don't know about it, who could definitely benefit from ethnic studies.
And our goal was to make it as accessible as possible, like using language that a majority of people would understand. It's not super highly academic, and so make sure that the communities we're talking about also have the opportunity to listen to what we're saying about them.
Especially in this time where like there's a lot of student movements to implement ethnic studies. So like we recently learned about a movement in Rhode Island where the students themselves are trying to pressure their districts to teach ethnic studies.
Okay, yeah. So this is for Izzy. Can students, or not students, can people still add to the Wellesley Collection today? And if so, how does that process work now that there are things in place like the Pennsylvania Declaration and such?
So, the way that works is that I suppose that if anyone wanted to donate something, they could. We're not actively purchasing anything else. We have a small collection, but it's solid. So I don't think we're actively pursuing anything else. In terms of purchasing more skeletal material, the way that works is you can't sell anything beyond a teaching purpose. So you can look on eBay and you can see that there are people selling skeletal material on eBay, but the way that it has to be used is for a teaching purpose. So it's listed as a teaching skull, a exploded word specimen to teach sinuses or something, so that you can really learn from it. Or selling things as a method of just purchase, and it can't be for profit. It has to be for a teaching and educational purpose. So I guess we could have more material in the collection. I don't see why people aren't as big on donating things, especially skulls, to people anymore, especially to colleges. So our collection is pretty much stayed the same since 1956 when they purchased the last shipment of material.
Anything else? Yes.
I have a question for Caleb. So you mentioned briefly towards the beginning that while this project originated for you as a case study, specifically in Tanzania, because you had visited there, specifically because you had visited there, you could see it going other places. Can you tell us a little bit more about other projects or other areas that you envision this for? Do you envision it?
Sure.
I can imagine that it would also be useful in a lot of schools and domestically. So where do you see this going so that it is able to branch out and kind of become more globally
accessible, right? Well, actually, so Seed Kit, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but we've designed all of the experiments off of kind of standard subjects that high school students are usually exposed to and tested on. So you could think of maybe if you took a chemistry AP exam, some of those subjects would have some of the material in our experiments, and we also modeled it off of several different countries' standardized secondary high school curricula. And it's true. We've thought about we could use it around the corner in Framingham. I mean, truly, the options are endless, but what is very restricting is the funding. And we're still trying to figure out that element, especially because we're not registered as an NGO, which is very expensive to do. That's the only thing restricting us. But the kit itself is designed where we could use it in Science Club for Girls, which happens on campus here. We could use it in Mumbai, pretty much anywhere that is teaching science. We've even actually thought about when we want to be translating our seed kits too. And we decided we're going to translate them into other languages only after our beta testing to make sure that the protocols are just right and that our pedagogy is just right. But you're spot on. We're looking very wide at this, and we're hopeful too.
And also, how do you work with teachers in the areas that you're distributing the seed kits to help them become a part of, like, think about what experiments they would be useful, and like what I mean, obviously different material there, like, it's a lot of the materials you're talking about might be fairly universally accessible, but what about tailoring it more to, like a little bit more to the different materials that are going to be accessible in different places?
So we've done that. Like my example with cabbage, you can actually use Jamaica flower. You can use blueberries, acai. We've included, for example, in the pH, a list of all different kinds of ingredients that you might be able to use locally. And we've tried to be as careful as possible where you wouldn't need to replace much other than maybe the pH indicator, but you can still perform the experiment without those locally resourced things. Some things we do take for granted though, for example, vinegar. But there must be, we give a bunch of alternatives to vinegar too, and we're just hopeful that once your vinegar runs out, hopefully there'll be a way to replenish it. But as for the vials, like instead of using an Erlenmeyer flask, we use salt and pepper shakers, and they don't need to be replaced. But if they did, you could even use a plastic cup. We're trying to make it as versatile as possible, but you've pretty much nailed it on the head, exactly what we struggle with, because we think of the classroom as having, like when we think of designing these experiments, we try and think of like, how could we make this experiment just completely self-standing, needing absolutely nothing else? And it's a challenge, because even expensive experiments, using all the resources you want, even that, it's hard to do. And then when you're thinking about, okay, well, what can I fish out of the trash and make an experiment from? It's another level of complexity. Yeah.
Any other questions? Let's thank our panel.